Thanks for this opportunity to speak about South Africa's National Infrastructure Plan 2050, or for what we call the NIP 2050. It's a demonstration of the South African government's commitment to make better progress in delivering infrastructure that is so essential to growth and development and critical for the foundation of economic transformation, frankly, in any developing nation, not just South Africa. So the organizers asked me if I would speak about this because it's very relevant to some of the topics this year in AfricaCom and Africa Tech. My role, just to say, is that I was a National Planning Commissioner in the presidency of South Africa for over a decade. And this work filtered into work for the presidency and for the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure to design a national infrastructure plan focused on 2050, but with a very strong view to the first 3 years as well. So that's my role. I'm also a professor of 4IR practice at the University of Johannesburg, amongst other roles. But my role has been as being lead drafter of the National Infrastructure Plan, and I speak in that regard. So not as a government employee or bureaucrat, but as somebody who is interested and wants to see the country progress and has been deeply involved in these issues. The real purpose of the NIP 2050 is to course correct, is to get better. The South African government is deeply committed to leveraging infrastructure for development, to create jobs and create a foundation for development. And that is true of any developing country that seeks to progress. It's not unique to South Africa, but the past decade has not gone very well for us. And we're looking for ways of strengthening delivery. And that is really what the NIP is about. Now, the National Infrastructure Plan, the way that it's being done is that it's being done in 2 phases. The first phase is looking at big ticket, big foundational bulk infrastructure in 4 critical network sectors, namely energy and especially electricity, freight transport, water, and digital infrastructure. And I should just say that the draft of this document was put out by the South African cabinet in August, and we underwent about 2.5 months of very deep stakeholder engagement. That document was revised, and it's now going back to cabinet. If approved later this year or early in 2022, then it would become the lodestar for infrastructure delivery in at least these 4 sectors. Then there's going to be a second phase that is going to look at more distributed infrastructure, commuter transport, and municipal services. And we separated those out because the way that they get delivered, the stakeholder engagement is different in their essence. So we wanted to take it step by step, given that we are trying to course correct in the ability to deliver. Now, I've long been deeply involved in AfricaCom and Africa Tech, running sessions, moderating sessions, and speaking. And this year is a little bit different than other years because there's quite a big focus on sectors other than telecoms and pure digital. In other words, a particular focus on renewable energy. So it seems like a good time to be thinking about infrastructure more broadly and thinking about transformation of infrastructure, not only telecommunications, but of course the cross-cut. And then of course there's a 4.0 type of agenda across all of these sectors. But for developing countries, and particularly in Africa, we all need to start seeing better progress in the delivery. It's one of the things that countries can do. Now the NIP is very focused on moving from, I might say, from rigidity to dynamism. That's a very big theme that underpins the National Infrastructure Plan for 2050. And what do I mean by that? The kind of shift that South Africa needs to make is actually very common to other countries. Now, as we know, driving significant structural change, in other words, promoting manufacturing, urbanization, all of these things, digitization, it requires big public infrastructure with long lead times and sometimes uncertain payback, where the market probably would not deliver as needed on its own. In most countries, these services were initiated by the state. In almost every country, they were initiated by the state and delivered through single technology government departments sometimes, and then sometimes utilities. So for example, you used to have water utilities, and maybe you still do, electricity utilities, rail and roads, and even the telephone company. When I was chief of strategy at Telecom, and the big shift we had to make was from a psychology of being the telephone company to one that is a fully digital company, properly engaged in competition and multi-technology, a multi-technology pathway. And it's a big transition that every single country has to make. Advanced countries have made it, and developing countries also have to make that leap. And South Africa is at the early stages of that transition. And I'm going to speak about that. So now the points that I'm making in the telecommunications sector may seem strange, because the private sector already plays such a big role in telecommunications that some of this way of thinking feels foreign. And so we have a much bigger telecom sector. And in telecoms, companies are the investors, they run the networks, they run the companies basically. Whereas in other major infrastructure sectors, the state generally drives implementation, and the private sector may partner, it may be a contractor in delivery, but it's not running it. And that is a big difference between telecommunications and the way it's rolled out, especially digital communications and mobile, versus almost any other area of infrastructure. But remember that even in telecoms, the state has to be able to regulate, issue licenses, manage spectrum, ensure effective competition, and drive access beyond narrow commercial interests, orientated to the fuller interests of the nation. And this is what the NIP focuses on. So again, infrastructure delivery is one of the most significant contributors to the transition from being, for South Africa, of being an historically closed minerals economy to becoming one that is more regionally integrated, low carbon, inclusive, and promoting of dynamism in industries of the future. In other words, it's the platform for dynamism. The industries themselves need to be more dynamic, and it needs to promote more dynamism in the industries it serves. Now that set of issues, some of these issues may be specific to South Africa, but that set of issues I've just described and the kinds of transitions that have to be made is relevant to any developing country that is trying to make the leap for, trying to progress and raise living standards and develop. So to give an idea of the kinds of things that the NIP seeks to chart, I'm just going to give a few examples. In energy, South Africa is currently the 12th biggest carbon emitter in the world, mainly due to the coal reliance for electricity generation. Now, that may not be true for many other African countries, but it is certainly true for South Africa. There's also a deep shortage of electricity that we've been suffering with for, I would say, about 12 years so far. Now, the NIP 2050 drives an approach that transforms this towards a more financially and ecologically sustainable energy model that ultimately seeks to have renewable energy accounting for 70% of the electricity mix. And that is partly for environmental sustainability, but it is also the least cost energy for South Africa because South Africa has significant comparative advantage in wind and solar. And wind and solar have become much less expensive to deliver, and also battery storage costs are falling dramatically. So there's both a financial imperative and an environmental imperative that dovetail beautifully within this agenda. We would see that 70% of the electricity mix, as I said, would be from renewables by 2050. And of course, there are other sources of energy as well. Now, this shift would happen. It would rely on a shift from a reliance currently on a state-owned monopoly, meaning Eskom, to one that continues to have significant state leadership because there are big public imperatives, as I said, but in a context of competition where it's possible, and multi-markets that enable new entry, new technology, and innovation. So there's a lot of emphasis on creating new market models. Firstly, a market and market models that enable entry, innovation, trading, even if it's not into the grid. Already we have allowed embedded generation so that companies can invest in their own generation. And we're now looking at setting up an independent transmission company that should enable independent buying of energy, and that would take it out of the hands of a state-owned monopoly, which would create competition. So in other words, the state-owned monopoly currently would have to compete with the private sector to be winning awards to generate energy. That is effectively the kind of change we made at Telecom some years ago when I was chief of strategy there. So that's the kind of shift that we need to make in each of these markets. It's particularly prominent in energy in South Africa. Now, in terms of transport, South Africa was meant to make significant progress, as any developing country would want to deepen penetration into global markets for our manufactured exports, and we have not succeeded in doing so. Now, one of the critical reasons for this is high cost and poor efficiency in logistics. In other words, freight transport and related services, which sum up into freight logistics. And with that, that is an issue within South Africa, and it's an issue of South Africa and Africa. In other words, South Africa should be playing, as the most industrialized economy in the continent, it should be playing a pivotal role, the way that, say, Japan has, China, Brazil, over the years in their regions. Unfortunately, South Africa hasn't yet done that. So the National Infrastructure Plan drives an agenda that would see much more significant public-private cooperation in freight transport. In other words, a move from a state-owned monopoly in rail and ports, and which causes an inefficient use of roads by the private sector. So we would like to see a better articulation of roads, that rail-friendly freight, would be moved over to rail more efficiently, and that we would see much more significant investment in intermodal transport hubs and freight villages that promote industrialization and a drive towards Transport 4.0, which means digitization and optimization. Now, we make a very big deal about strengthening the strategy for freight transport into the region as well, so that we have a strategy for regional freight transport links. The reality is now that sub-Saharan Africa is one of the most expensive areas of the world to get goods across borders, and yet we have a new free trade agreement across the continent, and regions matter. We can't forget that. So we need to be trading more. We need to see integrated value chains across countries, and we just simply can't do that unless we start seeing better cross-border linkages. Now, the third area that we look at, there are a number of areas. I'm just pulling out a few examples, but the third area that certainly the people at AfricaCom will be interested in is related to broadband. And South Africa, no doubt, has fantastic broadband coverage, and it's gone from strength to strength. And we have a fantastic private sector that has become more diverse, more competitive, and more capable over the past 10 or 20 years. There's just no doubt about it. And actually, telecom is now a proper player and has in itself brought prices down in the market and promoted new products and been a thriving part of competition in broadband and digital services. And that's a marker for what can be done with a state-owned enterprise. Now, the problem in South Africa has been, however, that there's been less success in achieving universal access and not that much success yet in driving e-government services. These are critical in Africa because with the long distances, the limited concentration of populations, even as people urbanize, but the distances that people live from services, e-government services could really bring down the cost of service delivery, bring down the cost of living, improve service access. And certainly it's absolutely critical for everybody, especially past COVID, where everything is moving into the cloud, that it's absolutely essential that entire populations are properly e-enabled and digitally aware. Right now, too many people think that Facebook and WhatsApp is the internet. We need populations that are completely feel a great facility and are savvy with digitally savvy with this kind of service. So the NIP focuses on far greater reliance on public-private partnerships and alliance. They're given great prominence in the NIP. And this is especially possible in the near term since the private telecommunications sector, again, is so robust and diverse and capable. The problem is that generally in the delivery of these kinds of services, there isn't that kind of partnership approach. I think the state still feels that it should be leading and driving and implementing, and the NIP drives a different kind of approach in that regard. So now, just my last set of points. The NIP 2050 focuses not only on what needs to be done, but also on how to do it. And often when I've been speaking at AfricaCom, this has been a theme of what I've been raising. That when we can look at all kinds of cool technology, but if you don't have the right capabilities in place, it ain't gonna happen. And what we often find across Africa is that we're not building sufficient human and institutional capability to deliver on the basics, and then also to respond to change, to respond to risk, and also to respond to opportunity. This is how we can become resilient and promote great growth year after year, but we tend to focus on cool stuff and not so much on areas of capacity. Now, I want to lift up 5 big areas of capacity that any developing country needs to build, and certainly these are priorities in the National Infrastructure 2050. The first is what we call knowledge and innovation services. And for that, I'm not even speaking about highfalutin stuff. I mean capability and planning, monitoring, budgeting, finance, procurement, project preparation, project management, and also sector-specific innovation, yes. But without these capabilities, it's impossible for countries to move ahead with confidence. And the state must have some minimum capability, and the private sector also needs centers of excellence, and there needs to be a dovetailing of that capability so that private and public are working together. It's absolutely essential. And then, of course, as part of that, we need to drive a 4.0 agenda for sure. In other words, digitizing infrastructure to be able to optimize and modernize. The second broad area is related to public and private cooperation and stimulation of competition. And there we need a state that is much more confident and capable of driving these partnerships. So it's not just an issue of saying we want to do it, and committing to do it. It's of having sufficient professional capability in the state that can engage with the private sector with confidence. As part of that, the NIP drives hard on a blended project finance and innovative green finance as well. And we have a whole section in the NIP about how we promote private finance and what's needed to be done around procurement models, around building the capability and financing models, models around public-private partnerships, and not even PPPs, also just different kinds of alliances that can be formed. We think that to achieve the infrastructure goal, about $400 billion is going to be needed between 2016 and 2040. We think that about over 70% of that is going to be accounted for by energy and transport investment. And we think what's going to be required is that private investment in public infrastructure would rise from, today it's about 2%. And we think that it would need to be about a third by 2050 to achieve this aspiration. So there's still a very big on budget element within that, but also a great need to strengthen our capability around public-private cooperation and blended finance of various sources, blended finance writ large. The third area is related to strengthening executive management and technical capability within the state and its entities, and also to strengthen economic regulation. And when I say that, when you promote competition, particularly if you have a monopoly, you need strong economic regulation. But when you have competition, you particularly need to, so that you're sure you're not creating private monopolies. That is critical, because it's not better to have a private monopoly than a public one. It's a mistake that many countries have made. In fact, you may want, and this is what South Africa is doing now, one may want to be creating competition before one is moving towards any sort of privatization at all, if that's even where one is going. Now, economic regulation needs to be more capable and advanced and aware of emerging state market relations and emergent technological trends. If I can say, my experience when I was at Telkom is that in South Africa at that time, there was a very weak understanding of the concept of convergence, as an example. So, you get a regulation of technology that is becoming outmoded and irrelevant, and you spend a lot of time dealing with regulatory issues that are basically only going to be relevant for the next few years, as opposed to concepts around convergence, so that you're allowing a regulatory, a pricing system that reflects the fact that different companies are going to compete based on different forms of convergence, different technological models, and they're going to offset pricing, in relation to that, and that has to be part of company strategy. But there's been a great resistance amongst regulators to say that is anti-competitive, whereas it's essential in a converged market. So that's just an example of the kind of change that would be required, and that is a pretty sophisticated capability for most regulators around the world, but it needs to change. Then fourth, there's a big drive around industrial development and localization in the design and approach to implementation. Included in that is a big drive to be strengthening our civil construction and supplier industry, so that we gain as much as we can from the infrastructure investment, but also the establishment, just as an example, of intermodal transport hubs and linkage nodes are a very good way of promoting industrialization around the places where goods are transferred between different modes of transport. And then finally, a very big theme is related to Africa Regional Infrastructure Program. And we are going to have to develop partnerships with our key trade partners. The challenge of a regional program, as anyone knows, is that you're talking about different sovereign nations coming together. And it makes it very complicated to come to agreement as to what's going to happen and to drive a program. But it is 100% essential for all of us in Africa to be driving this agenda. It's the only way we're going to be growing, is if we come together as a region. And the free trade area can only succeed if we get our freight logistics platform hyper efficient. Given all the other challenges that are faced, we need to have super efficient freight transport linkages between our countries. With that, thank you for your participation in the session. Please, I do hope to hear from you on some of these ideas and partnerships. Please do reach out. Thank you so much.